Last time we spoke about Stalin's purges. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany faced chaos and despair, giving rise to Adolf Hitler, who capitalized on the public's disillusionment. The Weimar Republic struggled amidst economic turmoil, while Hitler's National Socialist Party gained traction, ultimately leading to his appointment as Chancellor in 1933. He enacted measures that dismantled democracy and aggressively expanded German territory, laying the groundwork for future conflict. Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union embarked on rapid industrialization through ambitious 5-year plans, aiming to transform agriculture and boost heavy industry. However, this progress was overshadowed by brutal purges designed to eliminate dissent. As Stalin solidified his power, the repression created a climate of fear within society. The actions of both regimes intensified tensions throughout Europe, setting the stage for impending conflict. This interplay of political upheaval and authoritarian control in Germany and the USSR would play a crucial role in the escalation to World War II. This episode is Prelude number 6, Soviet Conflicts of the 1930s. Well, hello there. Welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. And you can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released an episode covering the defense of the Great Wall of China in 1933. And on Echoes of War, we're finishing up our multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Oh, and the latest episode on the exclusive podcast series is on the government by assassination. That being 1920s and 1930s Japan, when young military officers were basically killing everybody to try and get their way. If that's of interest to you, go check it out. Today we're going to be exploring major conflicts the Soviet Union ran into with her neighbors. Ironically, the vast majority of this episode is actually wars that I covered in the Fall and Rise of China podcast, such as the Sino-Soviet War, the Xinjiang Wars, the Mukden Incident, and the border skirmishes in Manchuria. So if you want a bit more depth to any of these events, well, go over to that podcast and check it out. The Soviets were engaged in the Far East from the early days of the Civil War, continuing a long-standing tradition of East-West interactions that have persisted through Eastern Europe for basically over 1,000 years. In 1920, Mongolia was occupied by white forces, remaining under their control until about 1924, when Soviet troops successfully defeated them. This victory was only achieved with the support of local guerrillas, led by Damdin Sukbahatar, who became one of the founding figures of the Mongol People's Republic. This event decisively aligned Mongolia with Moscow, which would have significant implications for future conflicts with China and Japan. The empires of Japan and Russia had come into conflict, competing for influence over Manchuria. After coming out of isolation in the later part of the 19th century, Japan developed a strong interest in Manchuria. This region was rich in natural resources such as coal and iron, as well as fertile land, all of which Japan lacked. It also offered additional space for Japan's rapidly growing population. Moreover, Japan was concerned that Russia's expansion to Manchuria would threaten its interest in Korea, and by extension, Japan itself. As Yamagata Oritamo famously said, "Korea is a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan." Then in 1899, a Boxer rebellion broke out, seeing Japan and Russia join a 8-nation alliance to combat the Qing dynasty in league with the Boxers. While they were technically allies, Japan was very wary of Russia at this time. This is because Russia had invaded Manchuria for the war effort, and after the Boxer rebellion was quelled, well, the Russians didn't go home. Thus, in 1904, this led to the Russo-Japanese War. In February of 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, initiating the war. The conflict quickly escalated, with Japan demonstrating its naval superiority and effective military strategies. Major battles such as the Siege of Port Arthur and the Battle of Toshima showcased Japan's modernized forces and naval strength, leading to significant Russian losses. Despite being a major European power, Russia faced logistical challenges and underestimated the Japanese. Japan's victories not only shocked the entire world, but it also shifted the balance of power in East Asia. Internationally, the conflict drew attention, leading to U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt's intervention in negotiations. The war concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September of 1905, brokered by Roosevelt. Japan gained recognition as a formidable military power, acquiring territories such as Korea and parts of Manchuria, which significantly altered the political landscape of Asia. However, it was to truly be a Pyrrhic victory for Japan. Both nations lost insane numbers of men and funds. For Russia, it led to the revolution that collapsed her empire. For Japan, they felt Roosevelt had cheated them out of the just rewards of victory, and this led them to go to war with the United States in 1941. In the 1920s, Manchuria was a crucial area for both the Chinese nationalist government and the Soviet Union, following the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the subsequent power struggles amongst the warlords. Jiang Zuolin, a prominent warlord, had considerable control over the region, and he was seen as a threat to Soviet interests, especially after he signed an agreement with Japan. The Soviet Union aimed to safeguard its borders and influence in the region, particularly in the face of potential Japanese aggression. The Soviet Union, feeling threatened by Jiang Zuolin's increasing ties with the Japanese, sought to undermine his authority. And then conflict emerged over the management of the Chinese Eastern Railway, a vital railway for both Soviet and Chinese interests. The Soviet Union had previously promised to return control of the CRE to China, as per the 1924 agreement. However, the implementation of this promise was complicated by competing interests. The Soviets aimed to maintain a certain level of influence over the railway, fearing the escalation of Chinese control would weaken their grip on Manchuria. Then Jiang Zuolin was assassinated on June 4th of 1928 by Kwangtung Army operatives. Actually, it's a bit of a murky story here. There was a possibility the KGB was also involved. Regardless, the Japanese sought his death to install a more pro-Japanese Chinese general that they had actually been grooming, called Yang Yuting. However, the assassination plot was leaked to Zhang Shiliang, the son of Jiang Zuolin. The young marshal, as he became known, became the new leader, and he firmly joined forces with Chiang Kai-shek's new nationalist government. Basically, the entire thing backfired tremendously on the Japanese. Now, one of the first things Zhang Shiliang took notice of as a leader was the precarious situation with the CER. In 1929, the Northeastern Army under Zhang Shiliang attempted to reassert Chinese control over the CER, leading to heightened tensions with the Soviets, who were keen on retaining joint control. The situation escalated when Chinese authorities seized Soviet officials associated with the railway, prompting a strong Soviet military presence. In response to these provocations, the Soviet Union mobilized a large military force, with approximately 156,000 troops, marking it to be one of the largest developments since the Russian Civil War. The conflict officially began on August 17th of 1929, with the Soviet attack on Chalinar. Although the Soviets faced initial setbacks, they quickly regrouped and developed a strategy to encircle and neutralize Chinese resistance. The Soviets implemented a series of carefully coordinated military operations, including naval strategies that involved advancing their fleets up important rivers, capturing strategic locations like Lhasa, and executing a two-phase attack to undermine Chinese ground forces. Their efforts culminated in several victories, showcasing the reformed Red Army's capabilities. By late November of 1929, after sustaining a lot of military losses and strategic maneuvers, the Chinese forces were substantially weakened and demoralized. On December the 13th, a treaty known as the Khabarovsk Protocol was signed, which reaffirmed Soviet control over the CER, but also indicated a return to status quo based on earlier treaties. The Soviet Union effectively regained control over the railway after having demonstrated military prowess and diplomatic maneuvering. The conflict revealed the vulnerabilities within the Chinese military command and highlighted the Soviets' willingness to use both diplomacy and military force. The Soviet victory bolstered communist propaganda and demonstrated the USSR's contemporary military capabilities, influencing perceptions in the West and, for Japan, regarding Soviet power and strategy. And I do have to mention this, the Sino-Soviet War is one that not many people are even aware of. Honestly, it's very underplayed, especially on YouTube. I highly recommend checking out the section of it in the Fall and Rise of China podcast. It's full of very interesting events, including a lot of massacres. Not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but there was a particular massacre along the border region, and to this day, Xi Jinping brings it up now and then. It's a real grievance against the Russians. Taking a sidestep from Manchuria for a moment, the Soviets also shared a border with China at Xinjiang. In the early 1930s, Xinjiang was officially recognized as a province of China, but had largely operated autonomously for quite a long time. In 1930, Sheng Shitai served as the military governor under the Kuomintang government in Xinjiang. However, he was not the sole authority, and he faced competition from a lot of other powers. Following a clash with one of these rivals, he sought assistance from the Soviet government, which provided substantial military supplies and financial support. In exchange, Sheng relinquished direct control over the province's economic and military affairs to the Soviet administrators, effectively establishing Xinjiang as a client state of the USSR, even though it remained a province of the Chinese nationalist government. The Soviets periodically intervened to reinforce their influence whenever they perceived it was diminishing. In 1934, they dispatched 7,000 troops across the border to assist Sheng in repelling an attempt by the nationalist warlords to oust him. This effort only partially succeeded, leading to a division of Xinjiang, with Sheng retaining authority over a segment of the province. This fragile arrangement persisted until about 1937. In April of that year, Uyghurs in the southern region of Sheng's control revolted, receiving unofficial support from the new 36th Division, a semi-autonomous group within the Kuomintang. This division had been engaged in conflict against the Soviets and their puppet governor since Sheng's rise to power in 1933. The Kuomintang never officially acknowledged the division's actions to avoid straining relations with the USSR, especially since they relied heavily on Soviet military assistance following the outset of the Second Sino-Japanese War in July. Lacking formal support, both the rebels and the new 36th Division could only resist for a few months, and by October, they had been defeated. Sheng Shitai regained complete control of Xinjiang, where he would remain until about 1944, when his duplicity with both the Soviets and the Kuomintang led to his dismissal from the office. And that was a gross oversimplification of a region with so many groups fighting for dominance I can't possibly get into in this podcast. Again, I'm sorry I keep peddling other things, but on the Fall of Rise of China podcast, I had to do this event known as the Xinjiang Wars, I think in about 6 or 7 episodes. And I am not kidding when I say there was something like 10 to 15 different groups of Muslims fighting each other for dominance over this region. It's a fascinating and extremely complicated affair. Honestly, if you have a chance, pull out a map right now and look at the region. It borders so many different places and there's so many vested interests. It was just a hot pot for conflict. Now, swinging back over to Manchuria, the Japanese had been planning a seizure of Manchuria for quite some time. The invasion of Manchuria was triggered by the Mukden incident of September the 18th of 1931. Japanese military personnel staged a bombing near Mukden, claiming Chinese forces were responsible. This incident provided a pretext for the Kwangtung Army, a faction of the Japanese military stationed in Manchuria, to launch a full-scale invasion. Ignoring orders from the civilian government in Tokyo to withdraw, the army moved quickly and occupied large portions of Manchuria. The invasion met minimal resistance from Chinese military forces, who were preoccupied with internal strife and did not effectively counter the Japanese advance. By February of 1932, the Japanese had captured key cities such as Harbin and Dalian. To legitimize its control, Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo in March of 1932, placing the last Qing emperor, Puyi, on the throne as its figurehead. This puppet regime was intended to portray Japan's occupation as a civilizing mission, emphasizing economic development and stability, but was largely viewed as an illegitimate occupation by the international community. That being said, the international response to the invasion was limited. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, leading to Japan's withdrawal from the organization in 1933. China appealed for assistance, but received little meaningful support from Western powers, who were too preoccupied with their own economic problems because this was happening during the Great Depression. Meanwhile, Japan continued to fortify its military presence in Manchuria and exploited its resources, establishing factories and railroads to benefit its war machine. Moscow viewed this as a blatant power grab by the Japanese. In one swift action, the Soviets found themselves outmaneuvered. Just months earlier, they had the opportunity to seize Manchuria, but they opted for a strategy of soft power instead. As a result, their control over the crucial Chinese Eastern Railway became insignificant. The Japanese now held dominion over the entire region. Stalin recognized that the Red Army was ill-prepared to respond to this new development. The new circumstances in Manchuria signified that merely rearming was insufficient. Defensive structures were erected along the new border, and strategies were devised to defend against potential Japanese incursions while also preparing for an invasion of Manchuria. Mongolia grew increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union at this time as well, and mutual assistance agreements were publicly established. Eventually, Stalin instructed a strengthening of relations with the nationalist Chinese government, culminating in the Non-Aggression Pact signed in 1937. While this agreement alleviated some tensions between the USSR and China, the Japanese remained unyielding. By 1938, the frequency of border clashes between the Soviets and the Japanese really began to escalate. Despite the issues in the Far East, Stalin's Great Purge was escalating simultaneously. Thousands of officers were removed from their positions, with many being executed. Amongst the most notable was Marshal of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who had been a key figure in the Red Army's leadership for over a decade. These executions severely impacted the command and control capabilities of the Red Army. The military command in the Far East, known as the Special Red Banner Far Eastern Army, then led by Vasily Blucher, was particularly affected by these purges. General Greinlich Lushkov, the NKVD commander under Marshal Blucher, was the main orchestrator of this purge in the East. By June, Lushkov feared he would soon be purged himself, prompting him to defect to the Japanese army. He brought with him a wealth of classified documents revealing the Red Army's positioning in the East, along with insights into its vulnerabilities in the command structure following the purge. Lushkov would be held captive in Japanese territory for the rest of the war. He would eventually remarry and resigned himself to live in Japan. He disappeared from the record in 1945 during the retreat at Dalian in Manchuria. It is unclear if he was executed by Japanese captors, killed by Soviet troops, or just lost in the mayhem of the retreating forces. The Soviet government's response to the situation remains somewhat ambiguous, which is code for they probably killed him. However, it is known that the command of the border units was reorganized and the new troops were sent into the region. In the days following Lushkov's defection, Marshal Blucher was summoned to Moscow, presumably to receive an official reprimand from Stalin. Although he was not immediately arrested, the NKVD increased their scrutiny of him. In July 6, 1938, the Kwangtung Army intercepted a message from the Soviet commander in the Posyet region to Soviet headquarters in Khabarovsk. The message proposed that Soviet soldiers secure the unoccupied high ground west of Lake Khasan, particularly the contested Jangkufang Heights, to gain a strategic advantage overlooking the Korean port of Rajin and some key railways connecting Korea to Manchuria. In the following 2 weeks, small groups of Soviet border troops moved into the area to fortify the mountain with emplacements, observation trenches, and communication facilities. This triggered Japanese forces to begin moving into the area around Lake Khasan in July of 1938, ostensibly to secure their position after a minor border incident and a claim to territory they believed rightfully belonged to them. The Soviet command responded swiftly, deploying troops to the region to reinforce their border defenses. The Soviet forces were composed largely of the 39th Special Corps, which included infantry and mechanized units, as well as some cavalry. The commander of the Soviet forces, Vasily Blucher, was tasked with defending the region against Japanese incursions. On the other hand, the Japanese forces, primarily consisting of troops from the Kwangtung Army, were well-trained and motivated, seeking to assert their dominance in the region. Initially, the fighting involved skirmishes and artillery exchanges as both sides engaged in probing attacks. The Japanese used their superior infantry tactics and artillery to capture some strategic positions. However, the Soviet forces, well entrenched and supported by artillery and tank units, mounted a considerable defense. A major engagement occurred between August 1st and August 3rd of 1938 when the Japanese launched a large-scale offensive aimed at breaking through the Soviet lines. The battle saw intense hand-to-hand combat, and the Soviet troops held their ground despite being outnumbered in certain sectors. Soviet counterattacks were initiated, and heavy fighting ensued around some strategic positions such as the heights overlooking Lake Khasan. As the battle dragged on, the Soviet side received some reinforcements, allowing them to consolidate their defense. The fighting resulted in heavy casualties for both sides, with estimates of Soviet losses ranging from 500 to 1,000 troops, while the Japanese casualties were reported to be a little bit higher than that, maybe around 2,000. By August 11th, after several weeks of fighting, the situation began to stabilize. The Soviet command made the decision to continue holding their positions rather than pushing further territorial gains. The battle ended with the two sides agreeing to a ceasefire. The front lines were reestablished at Lake Khasan, as the status quo was maintained, but tensions remained unresolved. Now, back in 1936, the Soviet Union had entered into a mutual assistance pact with Mongolia, allowing Soviet troops to be stationed in Mongolia to protect against potential Japanese aggression. In 1939, Japan had accumulated significant military forces in Manchuria, the most notable of which was, of course, the Kwantung Army, considered one of Japan's most elite military units at the time. On May the 11th of 1939, a small Mongolian cavalry unit ventured into a disputed area seeking grazing land. The Japanese responded quickly and forcefully, engaging in a series of skirmishes against them. The conflict began with only a few dozen cavalrymen from each side, but rapidly escalated into several hundred soldiers, tanks, and artillery attacking each other. Then in June, a general you might have heard of, Georgy Zhukov, was appointed to lead the 57th Rifle Corps, arriving with considerable resources and additional troops. In response, the Kwantung Army fortified their positions. This led to thousands of soldiers being engaged on both sides. General Zhukov was acutely aware of his career, and likely his life was at stake if he failed. General Zhukov began to mobilize his forces, bringing in armored divisions and increasing troop numbers in the area significantly. On May the 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Yasuo Azuma led several regiments to drive the Mongols away, but faced support from the Red Army. Azuma's forces suffered 63% casualties, an absolutely devastating blow. By June, the battle had significantly intensified, with Japan deploying 30,000 troops in the region. The Soviets sent Zhukov along with motorized and armored units to counter them. Lacking effective armored divisions, the Imperial Japanese Army relied on their air forces to target the nearby Soviet air bases at places like Tamsak-Bulak. In July, the IJA confronted the Red Army with nearly 100 tanks and tankettes, while Zhukov unleashed a force of 450 tanks and armored vehicles. The Japanese had superior infantry support, but the Soviet armor managed to encircle and defeat them. The two armies skirmished for weeks, with the Japanese believing the Soviets would face logistical challenges. However, Zhukov organized a fleet of 2,600 trucks to supply his forces, a really impressive feat. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, and by August, global politics began to shift, indicating an impending war in Europe. Zhukov was ordered to take a decisive action, as the Soviets could not engage in a two-front war at the time. Consequently, Zhukov mobilized a fleet of 4,000 trucks to transport supplies from Chita to the front lines alongside an armada of tanks and mechanized brigades. The Soviets deployed 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank divisions, and 2 tank brigades, nearly 500 tanks in total, along with 2 motorized infantry divisions and 550 fighters and bombers. What had been a very long stalemate was now broken when Zhukov unleashed his forces, sending approximately 50,000 Soviets and Mongol allies to assault the east bank of Khalkhin Gol. The Japanese were immediately pinned down as the Soviets executed a double envelopment maneuver. Subsequent Japanese counterattacks failed miserably, and their attempts to break out of the encirclement were unsuccessful. The completely surrounded Japanese troops resisted surrender as the Soviets bombarded them with artillery and aerial strikes. By the end of August, the Japanese forces on the Mongolian side of the border had been annihilated. A ceasefire was signed between the USSR and Japan on September the 15th. Now, despite what many people might believe, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol was not a one-sided victory for the Russians. It was actually a catastrophe for both sides. The Japanese would report 8,440 dead, 8,766 wounded, and a loss of about 162 aircraft and 42 tanks, with an estimated 500 to 600 Japanese troops taken prisoner. who were actually classified as killed in action due to the IJA's pretty insane doctrine. Some sources suggest that the actual Japanese casualties could have reached as high as 30,000. On the other side, the Soviets would report 9,703 deaths, 15,251 wounded, and the destruction of 253 tanks, 250 aircraft, 96 artillery pieces, 133 armored cars. Of the tank losses, it's estimated that 75 to 80% were destroyed by anti-tank guns, 15 to 20% by field artillery, 5 to 10% by incendiary bombs thrown by infantry, those being mostly Molotov cocktails, by the way, 3% by mines, and another 3% through aircraft bombardment. For those interested in this battle, you should really take notice that 75% to 80% destroyed by anti-tank guns proved that the Kwangtung's doctrine of adopting anti-tank measures simply by adopting anti-tank guns actually did do a lot of work for them in this. Now, the implications of this battle were pivotal. The defeat led to major reforms in the Japanese military, shifting focus towards enhancing mechanized and armored capabilities due to the lessons learned from the underperformance of their troops against the Soviets. Actually, I'd like to take a little sidetrack here because I happen to know a lot about this battle. I researched it thoroughly. There were those in the Japanese military, such as the famous General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who argued this was a pivotal moment to actually improve tank designs for the Japanese army. Basically, they wanted something that could outperform the Soviets. And they had the know-how and the capability to do so. It was resources that was the crux of it. By this point, they were heavily involved in the China War. You can actually argue about 80% of the military was involved in the China War, and they were stuck. To give you an actual figure, by the time of Pearl Harbor, they had about 51 divisions in the entire army, and about 35 of them were stuck in the China War. Thus, they could not waste resources on increased armor for their tanks, or larger tanks for that matter, because the tanks that they were using were highly effective against the Chinese. So whenever you hear people talk about how terrible the Japanese tanks were during World War II, and yeah, of course, they were absolutely garbage, but when you decide to have an entire war in the Asia-Pacific, and you need boats to do so, well, it looks like the boats won out for the resources. Anyways, I'll stop there. It's just my 2 cents. On the Soviet side, this conflict reinforced the rising prominence of General Zhukov, obviously, who would later become a notable figure during World War II, to say the least. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the conflict in the East, but there was also one in the West. Britain and France had been trying to negotiate a military alliance with the Soviet Union to protect Poland before the Nazi dictator launched his attack of the nation. By August of 1939, these discussions were all about to fall apart. As General Zhukov oversaw the final phases of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was secretly meeting with Stalin to persuade the Soviet Union to reach an agreement with Germany. This agreement was finalized on August 23rd, resulting in the division of Poland between Stalin and Hitler, while the Baltic nations such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland would fall under the Soviet sphere of influence, giving Stalin unfettered control over these countries. Following the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23rd of 1939, both countries agreed not to interfere in each other's spheres of influence, and to divide Eastern Europe between them. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939. The German Wehrmacht employed a blitzkrieg strategy, which emphasized rapid attacks combining air power, armor, and infantry to overwhelm opponents quickly. The attack began early in the morning with bombing raids on Warsaw and other key cities, crippling Polish military communications and infrastructure. Within the early hours, German forces crossed the Polish borders from multiple directions. They invaded from the west, north, and south with considerable speed and efficiency. By using fast-moving armored units and coordinating them with air support, they achieved significant ground gains, quickly encircling and isolating Polish resistance. Poland, despite having a military force that was brave and determined, was significantly outmatched. The Polish strategy relied on static defenses and a hope for international assistance from France and Britain. However, while they declared war on Germany on September the 3rd, support was slow to materialize, and logistical issues plagued the Polish forces. The Polish army was not prepared for the speed of the German onslaught or the tactics employed, which led to disarray and confusion amongst the ranks. On September the 17th of 1939, as Germany was finishing its conquest of Western Poland, then the Soviets invaded Poland from the east. Taking advantage of Poland's weakened state, the Red Army advanced across the border with the justification of protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities in Poland. The operation was swift and strategically planned, mirroring the German tactics of encirclement. The Polish government, caught in a pincer movement, had little recourse. The Soviet invasion further complicated their ability to resist, as they were forced to fight on two fronts without any support. The Soviet forces captured the eastern territories, and Polish troops were taken prisoner or forced to retreat to Romania and other neighboring countries. The swift offensives resulted in the rapid collapse of Polish resistance. By October 6, 1939, major organized Polish military resistance ceased altogether, leading to the division of Poland as outlined in the secret protocol of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Germany gained control over western Poland, while the Soviets annexed the eastern regions, including parts of present-day Ukraine and Belarus. The occupation was brutal, characterized by significant repression. The Nazi regime implemented harsh policies involving the persecution of Polish Jews and the intelligentsia, deportations, and systematic annihilation in what became known as the Holocaust. The Soviet occupation was also marked by political repression, including mass arrests, executions, and deportations of Polish citizens to Siberian gulags. The invasion of Poland in 1939 had profound long-term implications. It not only led to the displacement and suffering of millions, but also it firmly established the patterns of totalitarian rule in both occupied territories. The events served as a precursor to the extreme atrocities and war crimes that would unfold over the next 6 years. It also highlighted the complete failure of the international alliances and the inadequacies of the League of Nations in deterring aggression. Initially, the Soviets sought to leverage the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to negotiate with the Baltic states. Finland was asked to relinquish rights and territory around the Gulf of Finland and some northern islands in exchange for concessions in Karelia. However, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia received no such offers. Consequently, these smaller nations were quickly pressed into complying with Soviet demands. The Finns, however, resisted and turned down the Soviet proposals. Finland and the Soviet Union had long-standing territorial disputes, particularly regarding the border areas. The Soviet Union demanded that Finland cede territory, specifically parts of Karelia and the strategic port of Hanko, in exchange for land elsewhere. Finland, valuing its sovereignty and territorial integrity, rejected these ultimatums. This diplomatic impasse heightened tensions, setting the stage for war. On November 30th of 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive against Finland, citing the need to protect its borders from potential threats. The Soviet military, expecting a swift victory due to its overwhelming numerical superiority and modern equipment, initiated an invasion across the border. The Soviet Union deployed around 450,000 troops, approximately against 150,000 Finnish defenders. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the Finnish forces, comprised largely of regular military personnel and reservists, were well prepared for defense. The Finnish soldiers were familiar with the challenging winter terrain, utilizing knowledge of their homeland to their advantage. They employed guerrilla tactics, including mobility and the element of surprise, against a much larger Soviet force. The Finnish army was also equipped with skis and snowmobiles, enabling rapid movement across snow-covered landscapes. One of the pivotal encounters of the war was the Battle of Suomenlasmi, fought between December 7th of 1939 and January 8th of 1940. Finnish troops, though greatly outnumbered, executed brilliant coordinated attacks, managing to encircle and defeat the much larger Soviet contingent. The victory boosted Finnish morale and showcased the effectiveness of their military strategy. The Battle of Late Road took place on January 1st to the 7th of 1940, and it involved the remnants of the Soviet 163rd Division. Finnish forces, utilizing their knowledge of terrain, executed a surprise ambush along the Late Road, resulting in an encirclement and destruction of a significant part of the Soviet troops. Occurring from January to March of 1940, the Battle of Vuosaarmi was marked by intense fighting in the Karelian Isthmus. Finnish troops employed defensive positions and fortified lines. Despite Soviet attempts to breach the defenses, Finnish forces held firm, demonstrating resilience against their overwhelming odds. The Soviet invasion faced numerous challenges, including harsh winter conditions, poor logistical planning, and a lack of familiarity with the terrain. Troops were poorly equipped for winter warfare, they suffered from frostbite and supply issues, leading to disarray within the ranks. Additionally, Soviet military tactics were actually pretty outdated by this point. They overly relied on massed infantry assaults, which was extremely ineffective against the well-organized Finnish defenses. Despite fierce resistance, the tide of the conflict began to turn in favor of the Soviets by February of 1940 as they gradually adjusted their tactics, employing more effective armored and aerial units. However, they faced significant attrition, and the progress was quite slow. The war would conclude on March 13th of 1940, with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. The treaty resulted in Finland ceding approximately 11% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including parts of Karelia and the vital city of Viipuri. However, Finland retained its independence and a large portion of its territory, marking a significant achievement against a vastly superior adversary. I'll just say here, for the Finnish people, this was known as talvisota, and it was here that a legend known as White Death emerged. A man who, to this day, I still think holds the record for the most combat kills in war. What became known as the Winter War would forever be known as quite a moment of national pride for Finland, and a rather disgraceful moment for the Soviet Union, as they were clearly in the wrong during this war, and they officially admitted to this quite a few times. Nonetheless, the war between Finland and the Soviet Union would recommence shortly after. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the aftermath of World War I, chaos in Germany birthed Hitler's rise, while Stalin's purges gripped the USSR. As Hitler expanded territory and repressed dissent, the Soviets industrialized through brutal measures. Their escalating tensions foreshadowed the cataclysm of World War II in Europe, igniting conflicts across Europe and Asia.